I'm Susan Mueller. The Westward Movement was neither as glamorous or as glorious as we sometimes like to think, but it did inspire a lot of really great art. The Westward Movement began in the 18th century when America was still an English colony. Although the wilderness beyond the western border may have seemed free for the taking, it actually belonged to other countries and was inhabited by Native American tribes who had lived and hunted there for thousands of years. But that did not stop colonials such as Daniel Boone from encroaching on Indian land. This was against the law, of course, because the land was French territory, but that didn't stop him. Daniel Boone became a legend in his own time, and like what happens to all celebrities, much that was written and is still believed about him is untrue. Daniel Boone always maintained that Native Americans and white Americans could live peacefully together. And even after his own son was tortured and killed, Boone did not take revenge. In his later years, he told his younger son Nathan that he deeply regretted any Native American he may have killed, even if it had been to save his own life, and that the Native Americans had always been kinder to him than whites. This may sound pretty self-serving, but it seems to have been true. Boone was widely criticized at the time for siding with the Indians, and in 1778 was even court-martialed by the British Army because of it. So, it's a complicated story. Daniel Boone made his first forays into the Kentucky wilderness in the 1760s, when he was in his late 20s. He fell in love with the beauty of the land and decided that this was where he wanted to live. By 1775, he had already established an outpost in Kentucky, which he named Fort Boonesboro, and had blazed a trail through the Appalachian Mountains known as Boone's Trace, later called the Wilderness Road, which ran into Kentucky through the Cumberland Gap. But when Boone began leading white settlers along the Wilderness Road, this dramatically escalated the decades of bloodshed that had already claimed the lives of hundreds of people, Native Americans as well as whites. Like I said, it's a complicated story. Although Boone is sometimes portrayed as a backwoodsman who avoided civilized society, he was actually an educated man and leading member of his community, who was elected to the Virginia General Assembly in 1781. And despite being a creative speller, he could both read and write at a high level. His creative spelling has actually turned out to be a good thing for historians because it gives us insight into how Boone actually spoke. He signed one letter, "Your humble servant," humble servant. To us, this sounds like how pirates talk, which is true on both counts. Many of the pirates and nearly all of the American colonists were from the British Isles and spoke with the same accent as British people did at the time, and still do today in some regions. Although Boone was born in the American colonies, his father was from Cornwall, England, and his mother was from Wales, so his individualized spelling shows that he had a Cornish Welsh type accent. And as for the primitive carvings found on trees, supposedly made by Boone claiming to have killed various bears, most of these are probably fakes. Full disclosure here, I'm a descendant of Daniel Boone. He's my uncle, 5 generations back. In this still from one of my videos, the family resemblance is unmistakable. In 1803, the United States was not yet 15 years old, and its borders remained the same as in colonial times. However, some 60,000 Americans were living, illegally, west of the borders on lands that still belonged to France. President Jefferson, who believed that land ownership was crucial to human happiness, proposed to Congress that the United States acquire from the French government all their territory located west of the Mississippi. This purchase, which cost an astounding sum for the time of $15 million, became known as the Louisiana Purchase. The Louisiana Purchase nearly doubled the size of the United States. As soon as the check cleared the bank, Jefferson hired 2 men, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, to lead an exploratory expedition into the newly acquired lands. Officially called the Corps of Discovery, it is more generally known as the Lewis and Clark Expedition. Although accounts vary, the Lewis and Clark expedition consisted of 45 white men and 1 enslaved black man, a servant of William Clark. The main goal of the expedition was to map the territory and find a practical route across the continent. But the group is also charged with studying wildlife and plants, as well as geographical features, and with establishing trade agreements with Native American tribal leaders. The expedition left from St. Charles, Missouri on May 21, 1804. They traveled on a specially constructed keelboat, as well as in smaller boats, canoes, on foot, and on horseback. They arrived at the Pacific Ocean in what was then the British territory of Oregon a year and a half later. On the last part of the journey, they were accompanied by the Shoshone woman Sacagawea, who acted as a translator and guide. For her work with the Lewis and Clark expedition, Sacagawea was honored by the U.S. government in 2002 by having her portrait placed on a dollar coin known as the Golden Dollar. It's not a very good likeness. The Mandan chief Shahaka returned with the expedition to meet with President Jefferson. Both Lewis and Clark kept extensive notebooks detailing everything they saw or did during the trip, including maps and many excellent drawings of wildlife and plants. This drawing depicts a California condor, a species not known on the East Coast. William Clark was an especially good artist, as these drawings show. In 1806, as soon as Jefferson announced the successful return of the expedition, settlers from both America and Europe began making the difficult journey west to homestead the land. Being a homesteader was very hard work, not something many modern people would relish. However, as towns were established with schools, stores, restaurants, and other amenities of civilization, things began to get easier. The political situation, however, was poisonous. The two basic questions that caused bitter turmoil among politicians and the public alike concerned 1. Slavery, and 2. What to do with the Native Americans. This led to angry and hostile debates in Congress and in the press, as partisan and as vitriolic as anything we see today. The slavery issue concerned the question of how were new states created out of the Louisiana Purchase to be admitted to the Union. Were they to be slave states or free states? And who got to decide, Congress or the people by popular vote? Finally, in 1820, a compromise, known as the Missouri Compromise, was reached. All states above the 36th parallel were to be free states. However, to keep the balance between slave and free states in Congress, Maine was to be admitted as a free state, while Missouri was to be a slave state. But Missouri is located above the 36th parallel. So, serious trouble will ensue in a few years, resulting in the period of political chaos known as Bleeding Kansas. In 1830, President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act. William Clark, now a former governor of Missouri and currently head of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, set out on a mission to get the Native Americans to voluntarily relocate and thus avoid trouble. He invited the young artist George Catlin to join him and paint pictures of Indian life. Catlin was enthralled by what he saw and made it his life's work to paint portraits of Native Americans and document their way of life before it disappeared forever. Catlin made 6 more trips across the West between 1830 and 1838, visiting more than 50 tribes and traveling as far as the North Dakota-Montana border. His beautiful and sensitive portraits of Native Americans are among the masterpieces of American art. Catlin produced over 500 paintings of Native American life during his career. In 1841, he published 2 volumes of engravings, which included detailed descriptions of his time among the Native Americans. The largest collection of Catlin's paintings can now be seen in the Smithsonian's Renwick Gallery, displayed floor to ceiling as Catlin had done when he exhibited his work in what he called his Indian Gallery. As for William Clark, although he professed great admiration for the Native Americans, he had no trouble at all having them rounded up and relocated to reservations far from their ancestral lands. On the first of these forced relocation marches, some 3,000 to 4,000 Native Americans from the Cherokee Nation died of exposure, exhaustion, and disease. It became known as the Trail of Tears. For the 10-Minute Professor, this is Dr. Susan Ray Euler. In the next program in the series, we're going to look at the California Gold Rush, Bleeding Kansas, and the good guys, bad guys, and cowboys of the Old West. You'll want to watch it.